I'm going to be talking to Felix Whitton, who's a senior policy advisor for Clean Energy Canada, about a new report titled Lessons from the United States on Buying Clean and Recommendations for Canada. So welcome to the interview, Felix.
Hi, thank you, Markham. Very nice to be here.
Look, why don't we start off with a brief overview of the report, if you don't mind, please?
Of course, happy to. So the report is about this policy called Buy Clean, which is a fairly new concept, which is gaining some ground in the US and also in Canada more recently. So I'll briefly kind of explain the concept of Buy Clean because it might be new to many of your listeners, and then I'll go into the report itself. So what Buy Clean does basically is uses government infrastructure spending to buy lower carbon materials, such as steel, cement, and concrete, and sets limits and kind of transparency requirements on those projects with a goal of reducing the life cycle footprint of public infrastructure projects, roads, highways, bridges, public buildings. And the reason this is important is that there's been a lot of focus on the energy efficiency of buildings and energy retrofits. You know, we've all heard about those. Much less focus on the materials that go into the buildings. They can account for as much as half of the life cycle impact. So that's kind of the focus of the policy and the report.
I was quite surprised to note in your report that 46% of cement and 18% of steel consumption comes from government in the United States. And in other countries, government procurement accounts for 12 to 30% of national GDP. So the amount of material we're talking about that governments procure is really quite significant in any national economy.
It is significant, and we are actually we've commissioned some research here in Canada to get some similar numbers by a consulting firm, and we're hoping to get some data in the next month or so, but the early results show that Canada actually buys, the government, or all governments in Canada buy about 30% of all steel, cement, and concrete in the country. So that is a large chunk of the market, and that means governments really have quite a lot of power and leverage over, you know, creating a cleaner market for products that are produced in a lower carbon way.
Well, let's start. You've got 6 recommendations in your report. Let's start with number 1: start simple and increase ambition over time.
Right. So for the report, we decided to interview some experts from the US, policymakers, people inside government, and advocates outside government. There's been lots of activity on this policy in various states across the country: California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, just to name a few. And so we talked to about 15 of these people to try and understand, you know, the politics, the process, the policy recommendations from their experience. And we came up with 6 of these lessons. And as you say, the first one is
to start simple and increase ambition over time.
Starting simple. And, you know, as I explained at the beginning, this is a new idea. It's a very complex policy to get started. It's a different way of doing, you know, procurement for people in government. So the idea is rather than start with every single building material and all projects, you know, pick a couple of high impact ones. A lot of places have started with concrete because that's, you know, used in pretty much everything we build, and has a very large carbon impact. And you know, start by setting transparency rules around that first, and then phasing in kind of limits, embodied carbon limits over time. And you know, once you start and start building experience, you can then expand that.
Well, let's take a practical example. So cement is very carbon intensive, and it's also considered one of those industries that's difficult to decarbonize. So if I understand this correctly, governments could, as part of their procurement, say, okay, look, we are going to require you contractors to lower the emissions intensity of the product you provide, and that then incents the contractors to find suppliers of concrete that have implemented carbon capture and storage or some other new technology to lower the emissions intensity of their product. Have I got that more or less right?
Exactly. And yeah, and this is about, providing kind of incentives as well as, hard limits. And by setting out, this is the threshold below which we'll buy, that creates this incentive across the market for contractors to go and source out those low carbon producers. And we need the data as well to show that, that's happening. And, there's been research out of the US that shows this is very possible with stuff on the market already. You can reduce your emissions from concrete by as much as 33% for a building, 40 or 50% for a pavement or a sidewalk, but with very little extra cost. The materials are out there. The technologies are available. We don't have to wait for net zero cement or carbon capture and storage. We can start with what we have.
The second point is engage stakeholders in policy decisions. And, this seems so common sense these days. And yet very often I see stories about industries that were, sideswiped by new government policies, and they weren't consulted by them. Tell us why this is important.
It's critical because, industry, and I'm talking not just the industrial producers, the steel and cement industries, but I'm talking about the contractors, the engineering and architecture firms, all the way through to procurement staff in government. They all really need to be involved in this because it's challenging to do. So we need to get it right. You need to set those limits at the right level. You need to bring everyone on board from the start. And there are some good examples from our conversations. The city of Portland had a really robust engagement process. They set up technical working groups. They did pilot projects. They really tested everything out so that people were comfortable with new materials. Industry was on board. And I think, that's something that in Canada we can definitely benefit from. And we're doing great work here already. I should say there is a government initiative called LCA Squared that has been working with industry on kind of setting the data standards and collecting data. So we have, the fundamentals in place. And Clean Energy Canada, my organization, we have convened some of the biggest industrial associations and labor groups and environmental groups around the table who are all supportive and on board with this policy. So I think it's one of those rare policies, environmental policies, where we have everyone pushing in the same direction.
Now, another one of your recommendations is interesting. It's find a policy champion. And I can see this because, bureaucracies tend to, there's a lot of inertia in them. And so it sounds like you need somebody in a particular department or, whoever's coordinating this Buy Clean strategy across departments that really needs to champion this right up to cabinet, I would assume.
Yes, and this is another lesson we heard from multiple jurisdictions that we spoke to. You need, it's really good to have a cheerleader, a political cheerleader, someone to kind of make the public case, talk to industry, get political support. But also inside government, you want sort of champions within key government departments, in procurement teams, in the Department of Transportation, which are responsible for highways and roads. You need people to lead that over. It could be a multi-year effort, so you need someone with staying power, someone who can kind of get everyone on side. In Canada, we have a sort of the challenge here, I think, is coordinating the work across so many different federal departments. We've got the Procurement Department, we've got Treasury Board, we've got Natural Resources, we've got Innovation, Science and Economic Development, we've got Infrastructure Canada, and others, all of whom play a role and all of whom have to be working on this. So we really need one or two champions to lead that process and to kind of see it through to the end.
And final question, another policy or recommendation that you have is to use both carrots and sticks. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is, you could go the regulatory route and set standards, a bit like we have the carbon pricing benchmark for industry. and say, all the materials we buy must fall below this level of carbon emissions. And that's one approach that California, for example, has taken. And that's effective at screening out the worst offenders. And for example, screening out imports from countries with more carbon intensive production. But it doesn't encourage that kind of innovation that we need to actually reduce emissions and get to net zero. So the carrots or the incentives, that's where they come in. And there are various things that government can do during the bidding process to favor bids with low carbon materials, or after the project is completed by awarding performance bonuses, or providing direct investments in producing the data or in reducing emissions at factories and plants, to encourage the whole of industry and the whole market basically to move towards that lower carbon production, because that's what's going to keep Canada kind of competitive globally as the rest of the world is shifting towards a clean economy.
Are you encouraged that Canadian governments will follow these recommendations and take this strategy? Are we laggards and we need to catch up? And if that's the case, are we committed to catching up?
I am encouraged. I think we are starting perhaps a little bit behind the US, and we've seen the Biden administration really move fast on this since they came in with the executive orders. We're behind the European Union and the UK, but I've seen from conversations with government, a real commitment to this. They've, it's in the mandate letters. There was some money in the budget that just came out towards low carbon material research. There's work to put together a green building strategy. So I think everything is, in place. What we really need now is, that political leadership, that sort of championing, and, I would say a bit of a sense of urgency around this. This is 8 years until 2030. Heavy industry is really, has to do its part to reduce emissions. And I think this is one of those policies that can play a big role in that.
Well, Felix, thank you very much for this. Appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Markham. It's been a pleasure.